February 1st, 1980. TV screens worldwide showed these pictures of 6 American diplomats who'd escaped from Iran. Excited reporters told us that the 6 had hidden at the Canadian embassy in Tehran after fleeing their own embassy when it was overrun. They were then smuggled out of Iran with false Canadian diplomatic passports 3 months later. The only true statement the reporters made was that they left Iran on January 28th.
That was the best news I was able to announce during the entire Iran hostage crisis, a period during which most of my announcements from this podium were about American failures. Hello, I'm Harding Carter, and I was State Department spokesman during all of the events you're about to see. It was a depressing, frustrating time. The nation seemed impotent. The hostages were held first for weeks, then months, and finally for 444 days. When the news came out that the Canadians had first hidden, then slipped 6 of our people away to freedom, it was a welcome, if only temporary, relief. But what we did not know then was that hostage-taking would soon become a commonplace, rather than a startling aberration. What began in November 1979 reverberates to this day. Escape from Iran, the inside story.
Consul Bob Anders, career diplomat, the oldest of the escapees. Agricultural attaché Lee Schatz, department head. Vice Consul Mark Lyjak, an American services officer on his first foreign assignment. His wife, Consular Assistant Cora Lyjak, one of the only 2 American wives allowed to work at the embassy. Vice Consul Joe Stafford, an immigration visa officer. Finally, his wife, Kathy Stafford, like Cora, a consular assistant, and the second wife allowed to join her husband. These were just 6 of a total of 18 Americans who escaped the compound. All but 8 were later recaptured. What follows is a story that starts November 4th, 1979, and ends 12 weeks later on January 28, 1980. Tehran, the U.S. Embassy. A walled 27-acre compound with offices, fields, houses, and even a swimming pool. The main gates, which the attacking students would breach. And to their right, the main target, the well-secured Chancery building. Right at the back of the compound was the 2-story consular section where Iranians would come for U.S. visas or Americans in trouble would seek help. The consular building has a small entrance of its own onto a narrow street at the back of the compound. And it was in this consulate that Mark and Cora Lyjak, Joe and Kathy Stafford, and Bob Anders worked.
Well, Sunday morning, November 4th, started off like almost any other day in the embassy. We worked on Sundays there. It was being a Muslim country.
Bob Anders, consul, third-ranking official in the consular department.
Anyway, we all came into work and things were progressing normally. A demonstration did start up, but again, that wasn't necessarily unusual.
But this demonstration was to be unusual. It was not just angry students demanding the U.S. return the hospitalized Shah. The head of the U.S. Embassy, Bruce Langan, was so concerned he had left the compound that morning to ask the Iranian Foreign Ministry for extra protection at both the main gates and the consular entrance at the back of the embassy.
So they had closed the embassy consular section for the day.
Lee Schatz, the embassy's agricultural attaché.
The ministry that it wouldn't be opened until this deficiency had been corrected.
But Lee's second-floor office was open for business as usual. His building was not in the U.S. compound. It was 2 blocks away. The noise of the demonstration that morning did not penetrate to the consular building, where Cora Lyjak was working on the ground floor.
Since we weren't interviewing applicants, it was a quiet morning, where normally we would be running around and trying to hurry.
We had about 60 people in the building. There were about 10 embassy officers, perhaps 20 local employees, and 25 to 30 people in there on consular business.
Frankly,
One of those people had come to see Mark Lyjak. It was his job to help Americans in trouble.
well, one of the first people I saw that morning was Kim King. He had come to the embassy initially about a week before, and we were trying to help him out.
Kim King, 27 years old and streetwise. He'd been in Iran 9 months. He'd lost his passport and had no money.
Because he knew my situation, knew the problem, and he's the first to see.
As Mark and King were talking, the attack on the main gates began. Lee Schatz heard the noise from his building, and through his window saw his Iranian secretary running back from the main gates.
She burst into the door a few minutes later. Mr. Schatz had gone over the wall. The crowd in front, just as she had arrived to go in through the gate, people had gone over the wall, taken the keys from the contract guards inside, and opened the gate. Immediately looked out the window, could see people running around in the motor pool area, as well as in front of the Chancery building itself.
10 o'clock or so, we got a call from our people in the Chancery building, which is the main embassy building at the front of the compound, saying that the demonstrators were starting to climb over the walls, and advised us to lock up and secure the building.
About the same time, it seems that's when the Marine told us to go upstairs.
It seemed that everyone from downstairs, or at least many of the employees from downstairs, had been brought up into the relatively small area that was Bob Anders' outer office.
We were kind of waiting around to see what was happening and tried to keep everybody calm and cool.
But I remember we went into one little room where there were a lot of filing cabinets. I thought it might be safer in there.
Security had been built into both the consulate and the Chancery, but the Iranian students had managed to breach the Chancery and were now inside its basement. The consulate, though, was still secure.
Our offices were mainly on the second story, and we could see some of these young militants roaming around there, and they were immediately trying to get into our building. They were trying the doors, and within a few minutes, somebody threw a rock or a brick through one of our second-story windows.
Those were the only two windows for the two bathrooms that were not bulletproof.
They put a ladder up to the window, and a couple of these demonstrators started to climb up to try to come in. We had a Marine security guard on duty in our building, and he went in to repel this attack.
And he pushed the guy's feet out and legs, and I don't know if he went back out on the roof or down on the floor, and I don't give a hoot. But he stood there for a while, made sure anybody else didn't try to come through. Then he fired a round of tear gas out.
And I thought, well, the worst will happen is they'll come in and take over the compound, and in 2 or 3 hours, it'll be over. They'll go home and we'll be released.
But it was not to be. The embassy had been overrun the previous February, and that time the police cleared the invaders in a matter of hours. This time, the attackers knew the Ayatollah was behind them, but the Americans did not.
We had been told by the Marine that the plan was that at some point we were going to march from the consulate to the Chancery and go inside with the others. You know, that was not a very good plan, it didn't seem to me, because it required all of us to march through the demonstrators who were then inside the embassy.
That's when I got concerned about weapons, and I asked if there was any weapons around.
The Marine told King they'd been ordered not to shoot. There was to be passive resistance only. But elsewhere in the compound, this defense was proving to be ineffective.
After about an hour, all the lights went out. Apparently the demonstrators had gotten into the embassy power plant.
It was quite dark in most of it once the lights were cut off. And I think just it's human nature that darkness tends to increase fear. When you're sitting in a dark place, you can, perhaps your imagination gets away with you a little more.
We heard footsteps up on the roof of our building, and someone said they smelled smoke.
And we knew that there were people on the roof because we could hear them walking around up there.
I asked Mark, was there any air vents on the roof or anything where they could drop a grenade in there? because that's what they'd done last time. So assuming if they're going to do it, they're going to do it right.
The Marine Guard felt at that point that it was wise to get out. Also, fortunately for us, the terrorists had not blocked the street entrance. The consulate building, unlike the Chancery, has a direct door onto the back street, and no one was there.
Or so they thought. With the student militants now having captured some two-way radios as well as the switchboard, Lee realized his office could be next. He decided to leave and gave instructions to his Iranian staff that would protect them later.
They were to explain that I had been there. To their knowledge, I was not captured, and that the last time they'd seen me, I was walking out the office door. And I went out the door. They wished me good luck. I wished them good luck.
The departure from the consulate was reasonably well organized.
Vice Consul Richard Queen.
I was the one that opened the door.
Queen worked alongside Joe Stafford. He was held hostage for 8 months before being released with multiple sclerosis.
And he stepped back, and I was the one that opened up the door itself, and it was an uneasy moment because I had no idea at all what was on the other side of the street. You just didn't see. You couldn't see it from the building. So I opened it up, and there were 3 or 4 dressed as police, national police, but I think they're Revolutionary Guards, actually. And I said, hello, how are you, in Farsi? And he said, oh, fine, how's everything? I said, well, we're leaving the building. He said, okay. And at that time, people started to file out.
I saw they stopped somebody and looked quickly in his briefcase, but it was, I think, mainly to give the impression of doing something. They didn't seem quite to know whether they should stop us or let us go or help us or what.
The Americans had split into 2 groups before exiting. In Mark and Cora's group were the Staffords, Bob Anders, Kim King, an American lady we may not name, and an Iranian secretary. The second group consisted of the consulate boss, Dick Moorfield, 4 other Americans, and Richard Queen.
The idea was that we were going to go and go to Dick Moorfield's house. We were deciding whether to go to the British Embassy, maybe the Swedish Embassy, which is right nearby, but I didn't know it was closed on Sunday or not, or Dick Moorfield's place, and we decided that let's go to Dick Moorfield's place. The idea being we'd sit there, play bridge, and wait this thing out.
The first group was by now walking 2 blocks southwest of the compound and heading for the British Embassy when Kim King decided to split.
I had more business to do to get out of the country, and that was my first important move for me. So I want to go to the customs. And Mark and them, they had planned on going on over to the English embassy.
And then we went one way and he went another.
Also, there were local employees with us who, I think at about the same point, broke off and went their separate ways.
With the exception of one girl.
Yeah.
Because she was with us, and she was the first to notice the demonstration blocking our path, that there were demonstrators in Ferdowsi Square. She shunted us off onto a side street where we stopped briefly to have a little conference.
While the first group decided what to do, the second, led by Dick Moorfield, had locked up the consulate and were heading out along this street.
We were about 2.5 blocks away when noticed that there were some of the student militants chasing us on the street. Dick Moorfield said, just keep on walking, don't stop, don't talk, just keep on walking straight. And they caught up with us about 2.5 blocks away from the embassy. And there was one of the Revolutionary Guard / police was with them. And he fired a shot over our heads. And they surrounded us saying CIA, shouting CIA, CIA, etc., some other nonsense. And at that time, the shot was inducement enough to have us turn around, and there were about 7 or 8 of them. They surrounded us, and they escorted us back into the compound.
Just off Ferdowsi Square, the first group were still at an impasse. Demonstrators blocked their route to both the British Embassy and the Lijek's apartment. The Iranian secretary offered them sanctuary in her house, but they declined and bid her goodbye.
And at that point, Bob said, I'm going home. And we said, we're going with you. We just wanted to get off the street because I think I noticed, at least, it seemed like some people were starting to stare at us.
We were taken up into the ambassador's house. I was put in a room, one of the bedrooms upstairs, with Gary Lee at that time. Hands were bound. They first used a wire or nylon cord, which cut into the hand, really cut the circulation. They also blindfolded me.
Although all the second group were captured, for the first group, the safety of Bob Anders' apartment was only 4 blocks away. But opposite it was a revolutionary Comité headquarters.
So when we came to the street where the committee headquarters was, we crossed it one at a time. We'd peer around the corner, see if anyone was looking, then make a mad dash for the other building on the other side. And we did that, you know, one after the other. And then finally we made it into Bob's apartment, which was quite a relief, I think, for all of us.
As soon as we got in there, we immediately got on the telephone and on the radio. Everyone in our embassy at that point had two-way radios. And we were trying to call friends around town to see if they knew what was happening.
And we were trying to call different apartments and couldn't get answers anywhere, and we just couldn't figure out where they could have gone.
We were alone in what, you know, you had to call a hostile environment at that point, and that there was no one we could go to for help.
Really didn't know what to do next. I think we all had a stiff drink, probably. Calm our nerves a little.
We could tell that the embassy had been taken over because all of the voices on the radio from the embassy compound were those of the militants.
So at that point we became convinced, at least I became convinced, that we were the only ones who'd been able to get out.
The American woman who was with us after a while became concerned about trying to contact her husband. He was an Iranian. And then at one point, when she was making a phone call to a relative again, a relative of her husband's, the phone line went dead. And Kathy and I were rather upset about this because the line went dead right when she said, "I'm with some Americans."
But the message did get through, and the American woman's husband came to pick her up.
About 10 or 15 minutes after they left, we heard a knock on the door,
But I answered the door, and we were relieved to and pleased to see that this woman and her husband had come back.
And they had brought us some carry-out cello kebab, the barbecued lamb, which was very nice since we really didn't have anything particularly good for dinner.
The first night for Lee Schatz was spent in an office of a European embassy. His blanket was their national flag. His only possession, a knapsack.
You just were dependent on other people for everything. And it's a pretty helpless feeling.
Now, I knew that Mark, there's, well, at least the 5 of them that were in the consulate, Lee Schatz worked elsewhere, but they were not taken, or because I never saw them. And I saw, let's say during the first month, almost everybody, although we weren't allowed to talk for the first 5 months or so. But I never saw them, and I had already assumed they had escaped. I thought, initially my thought was, well, they'd gone out right to the airport and taken off.
Although many Americans working in Iran escaped after the attack, only Kim King managed to flee the compound and the country. In Iran, the 5 Americans who'd been at Bob Anders' apartment were on the run again, their third move in as many days. Now they were being driven by diplomatic friends to an embassy-leased house. Its American resident now held hostage.
We got out of the cars and went into the house as quickly as possible. We didn't want anyone to see us, and also there'd been a man down the road who had sort of stared into the car, and we were a little worried he might have seen us go into this house, which should have been empty because of the circumstances.
It was a big house, and there were some servants there who could help us because they could go out and, you know, get food and make it possible for us to stay indoors all the time.
It was not the most secure place. First of all, it was a house that was quite close to the street, so if anyone really tried, you know, we probably could be seen, although we tried to keep out of the windows and keep out of sight.
We figured that sooner or later they were going to check the housing records and would come and investigate every single property the embassy was leasing over there.
Also in that neighborhood, there was a night watchman who, in the course of making his rounds every night, would blow a police whistle very loudly every 5 or 10 minutes.
At one minute it would be very close, and the next minute it would be coming from someplace a few blocks away. And I don't know, just somehow it wore on my nerves very badly.
Well, especially that night, because we were already worried that something might happen. We were sleeping on the floor, and we were tense, and then having this whistle blow Plus, the man blowing the whistle was the man we thought had seen us in the car.
Right.
So I thought it would be a good idea to do something which I had had in the back of my mind all the time, and that was to call my good friend from the Canadian Embassy, John Sheardown.
The phone rang, and I get up to answer it, and found that it was Bob Anders. We were half expecting the call because we knew that Bob was out.
And I'll never forget the first thing John said to me. Says, "Well, why didn't you call sooner?" Says, "Come on over here. You can stay with us." And so, of course, I immediately felt very relieved about that. Then I said, well, that sounds great, John. By the way, I've got 4 other people with me." And he said right away, he came back and said, "That's all right. Bring them all. We can take care of all of you."
That offer of sanctuary by Canadian First Secretary John Sheardown and his wife Zina was to be the turning point for the fugitive Americans. For Zina Sheardown, who was not a Canadian citizen and did not have diplomatic immunity, the decision to take in the Americans was particularly courageous. At the Canadian Embassy in Tehran, Sheardown told his boss, Ambassador Ken Taylor, about the call from the fugitive Americans and how they might soon need help.
I was delighted to hear that some had made their way out and that we were in a position to be of some help to them.
The evening of the day that Bob called, the servant, the male servant in that house, for some reason got kind of spooked himself, and we practiced sort of sneaking out the back in case somebody came. We ended up sleeping with our clothes on, if you can call it sleeping, for maybe 45 minutes.
That same night, Taylor cabled Ottawa, and despite the risks, recommended Canada officially sanction what he proposed to do. The deciphered telex came to Michael Shenstone at the Department of External Affairs. He was to become Taylor's main Ottawa connection, and he fully backed the young ambassador's proposal. But the final decision rested with the Minister for External Affairs, Flora MacDonald. Upon hearing, her immediate reaction was, "Of course we'll help." She went at once to the Prime Minister, who was in the House, to tell him the news.
And it took him all of 30 seconds, I would say, to immediately reply, "Naturally, we will provide refuge for the Americans who have escaped from the takeover."
In Iran, the situation was getting increasingly dangerous for the 5 Americans. They learned their hostage colleagues were to be tried as spies, and one of the servants at the leased house had become unreliable. For the 5 Americans, another move was necessary.
When we left without even our laundry. It was in the machine at the time being washed, and we didn't even bother to wait for it. I think we've been holding back the paranoia for so long that when we finally couldn't hold it anymore, we just, we wanted to run as quickly as we could.
So they moved again to another house leased by the American Embassy on the same street. From this empty house, a scared Bob Anders called the Sheardowns again. Zina took the call as John was at the embassy.
The phone call was very brief. He said the time is now, and I said, "Do you need transportation?" He said no. I said, "Is there anything else we can do?" He said no.
When I did arrive, I immediately phoned Ken, Ambassador Taylor. I told him that we were expecting guests and invited him over. This was something that was prearranged to alert him that our house guests were expected.
Well, we were picked up by the same friends who brought us to this house, and they took us over to John Sheardown's house.
As we rounded the corner into John Street, there he was out in front, watering the plants or the grass, and which was a little strange because, first of all, it was November, and it really wasn't time to be watering the garden, and also, as I recall, I don't think he really had any plants or grass out in front there.
John introduced himself and Ken, but he didn't tell us that Ken was the ambassador, and he kept making references as we talked to the ambassador, and we thought that was someone who wasn't here yet, or I don't know. Anyway, it was, eventually we realized that Ken was the ambassador. And that was in itself also reassuring that he had come.
We were then told that we would not be able to stay together, that two of our party would have to go with Ambassador Taylor. And of course, we weren't very happy with this decision.
This was done in order to minimize the risk of all five being apprehended at once, and also to give both couples and the extra individual a bit more room to move around, and in order to spread the responsibility.
Ken felt strongly that if, by chance, we ever were discovered that the presence of two of our group in his own home would make the point that this was an official act of Canadian policy and not just an independent undertaking by John.
It was decided that the Staffords would stay with the Taylors. But first, Pat Taylor had to brief the servants about the two arriving house guests.
So I told them that they were friends of Ken's, that I didn't really know much about them, that there were two of them coming just for a few days, and they were visiting Iran as tourists. And this I related to Kathy and Joe and also to Ken, so that we wouldn't get our stories mixed up.
The Sheardowns had decided to tell their maid, a Filipino called Lolita, the truth. They trusted her implicitly.
I went into the kitchen and I said, "Do you know who they are?" And she said, "Yes." And I said they will be staying with us for a little while. And I don't think she was very surprised.
The five Americans had been on the run for 6 days before they reached the Canadians on November 10th. Now they felt an overwhelming sense of relief. And although confined, their lot was a paradise compared to the hostages. Diplomatic efforts to obtain the release of the hostages continued. 16 days after the takeover, 13 were released. The men and women had been separated until this point. They were flown out of Iran from Mehrabad Airport. This raised concerns for the house guests.
But one of the things we thought about was if the problem of the remaining hostages was solved in the same way, and the other, at that time, 53, were brought out to the airport quickly and sent off, it would be, to say the least, a little awkward for the Canadians to come chasing out to the airport with us and say, wait a minute, we've got these other people here, do you want to take them along?
Ken Taylor knew of their concerns, but like most diplomats, felt the crisis would soon be over. During that week, he had a visit from a diplomat who told him they were hiding an American called Lee Schatz.
The conversation opened by saying that it seemed appropriate that we could possibly offer some help, since he could easily be seen as a Canadian. My response was that, well, possibly, of course, we could, since we already have 5. I'm not realizing that he didn't realize we had the 5. I think he was as astounded as I was.
Ambassador Taylor arranged that I meet with someone who knew both of us, who would take us to where Lee was staying.
2 people came in the door. One who I'd never met before. It's a little bizarre because without any explanation, the person who turned out to be John Sheardown explained that the instructions were that I was to leave where I was at and come with him.
He accepted this with a little reluctance, but because he trusted the person I was with, he agreed to come with me.
The only thing I could think of was, wow, I finally met someone from the CIA. We walk out into daylight downstairs, looking around, very nervous, being outside for the first time in 2 weeks, and in broad daylight, which seemed like a sin. John and I walk over to what I was expecting to be a very nondescript car. It turns out to be a big black Mercedes. 2 people are sitting in a smaller car a little further down the parking lot. I'm going, oh, wow, you know, somebody's watching. I'm going, it's lookouts, one or the other. When we got to the house, I was, first of all, unaware until on that trip that it was the Canadians that the other people were with.
I purposely didn't say anything because I wanted to keep this as a surprise. There had been too few surprises up until that, pleasant surprises up until that time.
I came in, and I'm sure the first thing we did was sit down and have a drink.
He almost immediately took off his shoes.
He looked around and said, you know, this suits us.
Lee would not have been so cocksure if he'd known he was front-page news back home in Idaho. The State Department forgot to tell Lee's mother not to tell the press. In Washington, another journalist, Jean Peltier of Montreal's La Presse, was convinced some Americans must have been outside the embassy during the takeover and would now be in hiding.
So I found all my contacts, people I'd talked to before, and to each of them I presented the hypothesis and just tried to study their reactions on the phone. And that was a fairly long and tedious process until I came to somebody who I'll call my source in the State Department. And essentially what he did was to confirm the truth, which was some diplomats or U.S. employees in Tehran have managed to escape the takeover and are hiding.
Peltier thought between 6 and 14 Americans were in hiding in a friendly embassy, but he still didn't know where in Tehran they were. In Iran, both here at the Taylor's residence and over at the Sheardowns, life for the house guests settled into a daily routine. In the morning, listening to the news, then hours of reading, playing Scrabble, having political arguments, and drinking more than they'd ever done before.
In our opinion, I'm speaking of Zina and I, necessary to give them a feeling of family. And this was accomplished usually at over dinner, which was a fairly formal affair.
We were the kids, and John was Big Daddy, and we waited for him to come home every night because he always had something of interest, or hopefully he would, something of interest for us to hear about.
By mid-December, the Canadians were having to keep some news away from the house guests. In Washington, Jean Peltier talked to an official at the Canadian embassy there and called his bluff.
And I say, I know that, you know, American diplomats are hiding in our embassy in Tehran. Would you confirm or deny it, and so on? And that's when he says, well, I think his reaction was, Jesus, that's a tough one.
Peltier was asked not to publish. As he knew lives were at stake, he agreed not to. But even so, Taylor was cabled that a journalist had the story.
Upon receipt of the telex from Ottawa, I discussed it with Pat, my wife, discussed it with Roger, Lucy, who was first secretary at that time. I did not disclose this to the American house guests.
The timing couldn't have been worse, because it also put Douglas, the Taylor's son, at risk. He was joining them for Christmas.
Joe and Kathy joined us, of course, for Christmas morning breakfast, and we opened all our presents, and then we drove Kathy and Joe over to join the others for the rest of Christmas Day.
At the Sheardowns, Christmas Day was a real high.
And I had talked to John on the sly about Christmas presents for the other people, and I chose to buy worry beads. But I wanted to get something different and special for Zina.
The present Lee had bought for Zina was an Ayatollah rug. The black humor it produced was the high point of the day.
I can look back at that Christmas, for example, and think to myself that in many ways that's the best Christmas I've ever had.
We had a really good Christmas, a lot better than our friends did. And I guess that was something we always had to think about.
By January 1980, the situation weighed heavily on the house guests.
We got together and drafted a cable that we asked the Canadians to pass to the State Department for us, in which we essentially said that we felt so much time had passed that our problem was now a separate one from that of the hostages for a variety of reasons, and that some consideration should be given to active plans for getting us out.
The other 50
Flora MacDonald followed this up with the State Department.
But we were perhaps more anxious than they to make a separate break to say, all right, we won't include the 6 with any exit plans for the other 52. If we can get the 6 out on their own, we'll go ahead with that, and that's what we were pressing for.
She reached Secretary Vance in Washington, and on January 3rd, 1980, a senior official from the State Department arrived in Ottawa.
We held a meeting in my apartment that night, and we went over all the details for the exfiltration exercise, and it was decided then to proceed with it on a day-by-day countdown through to the end of the month.
In Tehran, as the arrangements for the Canadian staff to leave were implemented, Taylor told them to observe Tehran airport security for debriefing back home. Most of the Canadian staff had not been told about the house guests, and none of the Iranian staff knew.
One of the most significant arrangements, of course, was to provide passports for 6 Americans who didn't have Canadian passports. And I won't go into the detail as to how that was done, but suffice to say that Canadian passports were provided.
The 6 regular passports were taken down to Washington. There, the photos of the 6 Americans were added, and the necessary stamps and visas were forged to go with the house guests' cover stories. As this was being done, the Canadians in Iran had 2 scares. The first happened to Pat Taylor.
Well, one afternoon when I arrived home from work, the servant came and said there was a phone call for me. So when I took it, it was a very pleasant male voice with no particular accent, but somewhat reminiscent of a North American voice, asking to speak to Joe Stafford. When I said I didn't quite know who he was talking about, he checked. He said, "You are Mrs. Taylor, the ambassador's wife." And I said yes, and he also pursued that by saying, "Well, I have the residence on the phone," and I said yes. And so he repeated his request, and I again said that I didn't know who he was talking about, but that if he wanted to call Ken at the office, he could.
The call never arrived. The second scare happened to the Sheardown.
At that point, I was becoming perhaps a little more tense. I was aware of a helicopter over a home, which was very unusual, and I became concerned. It hovered, and it went on and on.
Bob Anders was outside in the central courtyard doing his exercises.
I naturally assumed they must have found out, and they were looking for our home.
We were always concerned about some dumb fluke getting us in trouble.
But it was a false alarm. The police were looking for an Iranian gunman who'd assassinated a religious leader in that area. At Mehrabad Airport on January 13th, the 6 doctored passports arrived by diplomatic courier. Canadian First Secretary Roger Lucey collected the bag and took it to Ken Taylor at the embassy.
Upon receiving the bag, I opened it and carefully jotted down various material that was in the bag, checked back one way or the other, attempted to put to memory most of the data. I went over this very closely with my colleague, Roger Lucey.
There was a mistake.
There was one change we had to make. There was one date had inadvertently been set ahead, and this was determined by Roger Lucey during a close scrutiny of the passports.
That discovery saved the Americans' lives. A mistake had been made in the exit visa date, which showed them to be leaving Iran before they'd even arrived. Now it was up to Ken Taylor and Roger Lucey to reforge the visas in Iran.
I think we both thought that the consular training that we'd been given was probably meant for more orthodox purposes, but in any event, it served us well at this time.
None of these events, including the escape plan, were mentioned to the house guests.
It was decided in Ottawa that we would leave prior to the departure of our house guests and other members of the embassy. Zena and I departed on the 20th of January, and I must admit that we felt that we were abandoning our house guests.
We were leaving the job unfinished, something that we had started up to a point, and we would not see the end of it. It was very essential to me personally that they would be returned home safely. And at the time of my departure, I was not aware of the outcome.
I felt that, you know, he's leaving, he's going to get on an airplane and fly out of here, and I can't. I mean, I know I didn't hold that against John, I didn't hold it against anyone, but I think it made all of us just that more anxious to be gone ourselves.
They had a sense of abandonment, of us abandoning them as well. The feeling that was mutual.
But they did make a tremendous attempt not to show it.
We told John, you know, just, hey, you know, you've done everything. Take Sina and, you know, get the hell out of here, you know, and just, you keep hoping for the best, but, you know, don't think for 1 minute that we're anything but happy for you, because that's what we were.
After they left, there was a real void. Roger came in, took over the house.
But of course he worked during the days, and for the first few days there was no one in the house because Lolita had gone by this time as well. And we were on our own, but whenever someone came to the door, which happened a few times, we really felt helpless, or the phone would ring. We didn't know if it was Roger, say, trying to get in touch with us, or someone that shouldn't be aware of our presence there.
To solve this problem, Ken Taylor stationed military police at the house. One of them, Sergeant Claude Gauthier, decided to chase away Bob Anders' growing depression by phoning Bob's wife, Linda, who was in Athens, Greece.
Called the operator and asked her, I said, here's the Canadian Embassy, you want to make a phone call to Athens. So I give her the phone number, and then I got Bob Anders' wife down the other end.
And then Robert came on the line. And I've never told anyone that he did get a call through, probably. He kept saying to me, don't say that. Say that differently. Remember, you're on the telephone, you know.
In the third week of January, Ken Taylor came to brief the house guests about plans to get them out.
We were given background information on Canada because, unfortunately, we're quite illiterate to our next-door neighbor to the north. I had to find out that it was actually Toronto, Canada, instead of Toronto, Canada.
Learning to say A and eating with our left hand.
The A.
We were given our new names and dates of birth and that kind of stuff, and asked to start learning who we were going to be.
All of us were part of a group of Canadian business venture and checking out the situation in Iran. That's why we're there.
The passports were, I don't know when they arrived, but they were not given to us until, I think, really the day before we left. We were given a chance finally to see what the documents looked like and kind of to see for real who we were going to be. I mean, before that, all we'd had was a typed sheet of paper, and this was the first time we really, I think, realized that this, at least for me, I began to realize this was going to be for real. It wasn't just a game as we'd been making it into.
There was going to be nothing fancy about it. We were going to leave through the airport the way any normal traveler would leave.
On January 27th, as Ken Taylor bid farewell to his wife, Pat, at the airport, Sergeant Gauthier drove the two Staffords over to their colleagues, Taylor arriving later.
We had an excellent dinner at what was formerly the Sheardowns house, but was now occupied by Roger Lucy. The dinner, of course, featured Canadian-American toasts of friendship and goodwill, best wishes for the morning's departure, and I think it's fair to say that there wasn't a great deal of inclination to go to sleep, because you had to be at the airport at least 3.5 hours before flight departure time, which meant that everyone had to get up at either 3:30 or 4 in the morning.
For most of us, the way of dealing with the threat, you know, the danger of trying this escape was to kid about it. For Joe, it obviously was something different.
I made it blatantly clear to Joe Stafford, who really was the one who had the most serious reservations, that I didn't really much give a damn what he was going to do tomorrow morning. I was going to be on an airplane.
I think we all knew that this was it. I mean, it's hard to describe the atmosphere.
Claude and Roger Lucy ran us through an interrogation. Roger would actually have probably made a very good Gestapo interrogator.
He also had his camouflage outfit on, so he looked like a typical Revolutionary Guard. It was very effective.
Yeah. I promptly volunteered to be the first one to go through and promptly screwed up, not realizing where my visa had been issued.
That didn't exactly reassure Joe. So after Ken Taylor had gone home and the rest had gone to bed, Lee sat up with Joe Stafford, convincing him that the plan was foolproof.
The biggest difficulty is that I was drinking Cointreau the whole time I was trying to do that, and by the time we finally had worked it out, I was very early in the morning.
We got out very early. I think it was about 4 a.m.
Well, Lee was a little bit of a problem, I think. It was hard to wake him up.
And the first thing I saw was Lee Schatz running down the hall in his underwear, screaming at the top of his lungs that his head hurt.
Cora was appropriately aghast, but no big deal.
I was a little worried about him, that he might still have the after effects of the party the night before.
The Americans had to get ready, pack what they had available. Some of the suitcases, of course, were ours. Some of the clothes, in order to give an impression of being with us, were ours as well.
I slightly changed my appearance. I was wearing dark glasses. I think I used a little eyebrow pencil to darken up my eyebrows. I combed my hair in a little different way. And the girls changed their hairdos.
The Americans made their way to the airport in our office cars as friends of mine.
All the way to the airport, I was debating if I was going to die or what. Feeling definitely not my best when I got there, but possibly in the best shape you'd want to be going through the Iranian airports.
You know, when you're sitting there in the car and it's dark and you're just driving it, I began to imagine all sorts of terrible things that were going to happen when we got there.
To walk into a crowded airport lobby was very scary. It felt very strange. But after we stood there for a minute or so, then it was okay. But that made me very nervous.
Somehow, Lee again did get separated, and he went through the line first, through the customs and immigration.
Normally, the man stood there, took your passport, stamped it, ripped out the yellow sheet, and you were on your way. That particular morning, there, for some reason, was a change. He took my passport, looked at it, and stepped into a side room. My only thought, and I turned around at that point, was and looked behind me 20 yards back down this alleyway coming out of where the tickets were purchased, was that, wow, if something goes wrong here, I hope they see me. Because we did have a plan to walk right back out of the airport if there were any difficulties.
We had left the two cars there with instructions to stay until the plane had actually taken off.
The guy came out after several minutes, looked at me, looked at the picture in my passport, which was indeed a picture of me. The problem, however, was that I'd had a much larger mustache at that time that drooped down like a bandit. And he looked at me and in broken English said, "Is this you?" And it was a very stern picture, no smile. And that morning I was trying to be as cheerful as I really could when I was talking to any of the officials. And I got a very stern look on my face and pulled down my mustache and said, "Yes." And he kind of smiled, and then I smiled, and he handed me my passport. And on I went.
I was confused because I couldn't find out who I was supposed to see. There was nobody there. And finally, after thinking momentarily about just skipping immigration and going directly to the departure lounge, which I think I could have gotten away with, we decided that we'd better go and try to find the man because someone later on might check if we'd cleared immigration, and we'd raise more suspicions if we didn't have the stamp, obviously. When we finally did find him, he was in a little back room. He came out and didn't even look at my picture, just pulled out the paper and stamped it and stamped the passport, and that was it.
After we'd gone through all the procedures, we were sitting in the waiting room, and some of the other Canadians from the embassy were going out on another flight at approximately the same time.
Who were unaware that we were actually leaving the country.
Of course, we had to pretend that we did not know them.
One of them had a big Canadian maple leaf on the side of one of his pieces of carry-on luggage. And I glanced over and looked at him, and in my best Canadian said, "Canadian, eh?" And his response was just, I mean, he was coming out of just total stun that we were possibly there, trying to do what we were doing, and then we explained that, you know, we're from Canada too, you know, we're going back to Edmonton.
But just almost as soon as these passengers had left the waiting room, it was announced that our flight was being delayed for, I think, approximately 3 hours because of some kind of engine trouble.
In anticipation of this, we had arranged for an alternative flight on a rival airline later that morning.
We didn't know what to do. Should we try to quickly go over and get on this other plane where the passengers had just left, or should we wait and sweat it out?
Now, technical problems, as you know, can range from an engine misplacement to something more serious.
It was finally decided that it would create too much of a disturbance if we suddenly left and tried to get on the other plane, because it would have appeared to be rather unusual to have reservations on several different flights. So we decided we'll just sit there and sweat it out.
The problem turned out to be minor, and after waiting 15 minutes, they were told to board.
That's the point where you really begin anticipating. I mean, you're so close, but yet there are still a few more vital things to do. And going on board and sitting down was, you know, just that much closer. And mentally, I think we were counting now to minutes. And fortunately, once we were on board, takeoff was almost immediate.
Lee and I both leaned out in the aisle and looked at each other with a kind of a knowing look and smile on our face, and we were really very happy then.
We toasted to the mountains as we flew over the Turkish border, which was obviously the high point of the trip. I mean, it just felt so good to be finally out of there.
Upon hearing the good news that the flight had departed, a bit late, but successfully, I then packed, went down to the embassy to do something that very few diplomats have the questionable or dubious satisfaction of doing. That is, destroying the cipher equipment. In this, I was greatly aided by Sergeant Gauthier, who I think now should be identified as Sledge Gauthier.
And as you know, if you take a big sledgehammer like this and smash equipment, well, it goes to pieces, so that's how I became Sledge Gauthier, and I almost became from the third floor to the second floor also, because I made a big hole about that big in the floor.
After sending his Iranian staff home, Ken Taylor and the remaining 3 Canadians closed the embassy and departed for the airport. The house guests were now on their final approach.
Finally, we landed in Frankfurt and back in the real world. And it was a great feeling to be out of that situation.
That we both kind of looked at each other and then just in unison stomped our feet out of the ground one more time. And it was over for us.
We now know that unlike the Canadians, 3 other embassies in Tehran decided not to help: New Zealand, Great Britain, and Sweden. We also know that the CIA played only a small role in the Great Escape, providing technical assistance in altering the passport dates just before departure. The American woman who helped can still not be identified, because to do so would endanger her and her family. We're pleased to be able to report that the 6 Americans who escaped are all well. Lee Schatz, the agricultural attaché, has left the government and become Director of International Development for a dairy company in Minneapolis. He's now married with 2 sons. Mark and Cora Lijek have also had 2 boys. After postings in Hong Kong and Kathmandu, they are now in Warsaw, where Cora teaches English and Mark is the administrative officer at the U.S. Embassy. Joe and Kathy Stafford also became parents, and Joe is presently posted in Washington. Bob Anders, the leader of the escape group, was posted to Norway and then Jamaica. He's now the consul at the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. He retires March 1990. Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor received the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor and was given Canada's highest award, the Order of Canada, as was his wife Pat, along with John Sheardown and his wife Zena. The Canadian paper made Ken Taylor a national hero. He then moved to New York and private industry. It was a great story, a tremendous saga of bravery and decency, of diplomats going beyond the book, of a neighboring nation proving what true friendship was all about. But despite the fact that all the hostages joined the Lucky 6 about a year later, other Americans less fortunate have subsequently learned that the lessons being taught in Tehran were being digested elsewhere in the Middle East. Despite insistent promises that Americans would never again be held hostage, they have been, and they are, many for far longer than those held in Iran. We still have no antidote or answer, and that, sadly enough, is the enduring legacy of the events set in motion on November 4th, 1979.
Well, in a few minutes this evening, we move to ancient Herculaneum to examine what happened during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 A.D., where people were sort of frozen in mud. The story of Vesuvius is next. Sunday evening, we present the series World War I, originally produced by CBS News, chronicling some of the important events of World War I. That starts Sunday evening at 10 o'clock. And next Tuesday evening, our science series Nova here on KQED presents an examination of the bomb's lethal legacy, an examination of the alarming nuclear waste problem in eastern Washington, 8 p.m. Tuesday night. And again, the National Geographic special about Vesuvius, the volcano, in about 4 minutes.